Deep in the humid rainforests of southern Mexico, buried beneath centuries of jungle growth and volcanic ash, lies one of history's most perplexing mysteries. A civilization so ancient, so sophisticated, and yet so completely vanished that archaeologists are still struggling to piece together who they really were. They left behind no written language we can read, no bones that survived the humid climate, and no clear records of their beliefs or customs. What they did leave behind is far more haunting. Massive stone heads weighing up to 28 tons, carved with such precision and individuality that they seem to stare back at us from across 3 millennia of silence. These are the Olmecs, and they might just be the most important civilization you've never heard of. While most people learn about the Maya, the Aztecs, or the Incas when studying ancient American civilizations, the Olmecs came first. They emerged from the swampy coastal lowlands of what is now Mexico around 1200 BC, during a time when most of the world was still struggling with basic agriculture and simple tools. Yet somehow, in this unlikely corner of the world, they developed innovations that wouldn't appear in other civilizations for centuries. Sophisticated mathematics, complex calendars, rubber processing, and monumental architecture that required engineering skills we're still trying to understand today. But here's what makes the Olmecs truly extraordinary. They didn't just build a great civilization, they built the foundation for every major culture that would follow in Mesoamerica. The Maya borrowed their calendar system. The Aztecs adopted their religious practices. Civilizations across Central America inherited their artistic styles, their ballgame, and even their concept of zero. In the world of archaeology, they're known as the mother culture of the Americas, and yet, most of what we think we know about them is still educated guesswork. Tonight, we're going to dive deep into this mystery. We'll explore how a people living in one of the most challenging environments on Earth managed to create some of humanity's most impressive early achievements. We'll examine the colossal stone heads that have puzzled researchers for decades, investigate their mysterious writing system that predates Maya hieroglyphs, and try to understand why this incredibly advanced civilization simply vanished around 400 BC, leaving behind more questions than answers. The story begins in a place that seems almost designed to discourage human settlement. The Olmec heartland, stretched across the modern Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco, a region where annual rainfall exceeds 100 inches, where rivers flood constantly, and where thick jungle canopy blocks out most sunlight. The landscape is dominated by swamps, meandering waterways, and dense tropical forest that extends as far as the eye can see. Temperatures rarely drop below sweltering, and the humidity is so intense that organic materials, including human bones, decompose completely within centuries. This is not the kind of place where you'd expect to find the birthplace of American civilization. Most early cultures developed in river valleys with predictable flooding patterns, or in highland areas with clear, seasonal changes. The Mesopotamians had the Tigris and Euphrates, the Egyptians had the Nile. The Indus Valley civilization had, well, the Indus Valley, but the Olmecs chose to build their society in what amounts to a massive, constantly flooded jungle. Yet this apparent disadvantage may have been their greatest strength. The frequent flooding deposited rich alluvial soils perfect for agriculture. The tropical environment provided an incredible diversity of resources: rubber trees, whose latex they learned to process thousands of years before anyone else, abundant wildlife for hunting, and strategic waterways that served as natural highways for trade and communication. Most importantly, the challenging environment may have forced them to develop the kind of cooperative social organization that would become the hallmark of their civilization. Archaeological evidence suggests that by 1400 BC, the Olmecs had established their first major center at San Lorenzo, a site that would dominate the region for nearly 500 years. But calling San Lorenzo simply a site hardly does justice to what archaeologists found there. This was a planned urban center, built on an artificially modified plateau that rose above the surrounding floodplains. The Olmecs had literally reshaped the landscape, creating a series of terraces, drainage systems, and elevated platforms that protected their most important buildings from seasonal flooding. The engineering required for this transformation was staggering. Without metal tools, wheeled vehicles, or beasts of burden, the Olmecs moved millions of tons of earth to create their ceremonial centers. They built sophisticated drainage systems that channeled rainwater away from important structures. They raised houses on stilts and created elevated walkways to navigate the frequently flooded terrain. Most impressively, they figured out how to transport massive basalt boulders weighing up to 28 tons across more than 50 miles of difficult terrain, from quarries in the Tuxtla Mountains to their ceremonial sites. This brings us to perhaps the most famous and mysterious aspect of Olmec civilization, the colossal heads. 17 of these massive sculptures have been discovered so far, each one carved from a single basalt boulder, with such precision and artistry that they rank among the finest achievements of ancient sculpture anywhere in the world. The heads range in height from about 5 feet to over 11 feet tall, and each one is completely unique. They display individual facial features, distinctive helmet-like headdresses, and what appears to be careful attention to portraying specific people rather than generic figures. The level of skill required to create these sculptures is almost incomprehensible when you consider the tools available to Olmec artists. Basalt is one of the hardest volcanic rocks, rating about 6 on the Mohs hardness scale. Carving it requires incredible patience and expertise, especially when creating the kind of fine detail visible in the colossal heads. The Olmecs somehow managed to achieve smooth, polished surfaces and intricate carved details using nothing but stone tools, controlled fracturing techniques, and an enormous amount of human labor. But the real mystery isn't how they carved the heads, it's why. Each head appears to represent a specific individual, leading most archaeologists to believe they are portraits of Olmec rulers. The elaborate headdresses may indicate different dynasties or political affiliations. Some heads show evidence of deliberate damage or killing, suggesting they may have been ritually destroyed when a ruler died or was overthrown. Others were carefully buried, as if they were being preserved for future generations or protected from enemies. Even more intriguing is the discovery that many of the colossal heads were recycled from earlier monuments. At least 13 of the 17 known heads have flat backs, suggesting they were originally massive stone thrones that were later recarved into portrait heads. This practice of transformation reveals something fascinating about Olmec political and religious concepts. Perhaps when a ruler died, his throne was converted into a permanent memorial. Or maybe the recycling reflects changing political fortunes, with new rulers literally reshaping the monuments of their predecessors. The mystery deepens when you consider the apparent systematic burial of many heads. Around 900 BC, most of the colossal heads at San Lorenzo were carefully buried, along with other important sculptures. This wasn't random destruction or natural disaster, it was a deliberate, organized effort that must have required significant labor and planning. Some archaeologists believe this represents a ritual closing of the site, perhaps connected to the transfer of power to La Venta, which became the dominant Olmec center after San Lorenzo's decline. This pattern of deliberate burial and site abandonment is one of the most puzzling aspects of Olmec civilization. Unlike other ancient cultures that were conquered by enemies or destroyed by natural disasters, the Olmecs seem to have systematically abandoned their major centers in an orderly fashion, taking care to preserve or ritually close important monuments before moving on. The systematic nature of these site abandonments points to something even more extraordinary about Olmec society: their level of political and religious organization. Moving an entire civilization doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen without sophisticated planning and social coordination. The evidence suggests that Olmec society was far more complex and hierarchical than the scattered villages and simple chiefdoms that characterized most of the world during this period. At the height of their power, around 900 BC, the Olmecs controlled trade networks that stretched across much of Mesoamerica. Obsidian from the highlands of Guatemala has been found at Olmec sites. Jade from distant mountain sources appears in their most sacred offerings. Iron ore mirrors, polished to perfection, were traded hundreds of miles from their points of origin. This wasn't casual bartering between neighboring villages, this was organized. Long-distance commerce that required permanent trading relationships, standardized exchange rates, and probably some form of diplomatic protection for merchants traveling through foreign territories. The scale of this trade network becomes even more impressive when you realize that the Olmecs were operating without several technologies that we typically associate with advanced civilizations. They had no wheeled vehicles for land transport. They had no horses, oxen, or other beasts of burden. They had no written contracts or accounting systems that we can read today. Yet somehow, they managed to coordinate economic activities across thousands of square miles of difficult terrain, maintaining trade relationships that lasted for centuries. This economic sophistication was matched by equally impressive achievements in what we might call the intellectual sphere. Recent archaeological discoveries have revolutionized our understanding of Olmec contributions to human knowledge, revealing innovations that were once attributed to later civilizations. In 2006, archaeologists announced the discovery of the Cascajal Block, a serpentine slab covered with 62 distinct symbols arranged in what appears to be organized text. Dating to around 900 BC, this artifact represents the earliest known writing system in the Americas, predating Maya hieroglyphs by several centuries. The implications of this discovery are staggering. If the Cascajal Block truly represents a writing system, it means the Olmecs developed literacy independently, joining the exclusive club of civilizations that invented writing from scratch. Only a handful of cultures in human history have achieved this. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia, the Egyptians along the Nile, the Chinese in the Yellow River Valley, and possibly the inhabitants of the Indus Valley. The fact that the Olmecs accomplished this in the challenging environment of tropical Mexico, without contact with Old World civilizations, speaks to their extraordinary intellectual capabilities. But writing wasn't their only contribution to human knowledge. Evidence increasingly suggests that the Olmecs developed the mathematical concepts that would become fundamental to all later Mesoamerican civilizations. The famous long count calendar, which allowed Maya astronomers to calculate dates thousands of years into the past and future, appears to have been an Olmec invention. More significantly, the Olmecs may have been the first people in the Americas to develop the concept of zero as a placeholder in mathematical calculations, an innovation that wouldn't appear in European mathematics until centuries later. Their understanding of astronomy was equally sophisticated. Olmec sites show careful alignment with celestial events, suggesting they tracked the movements of planets and stars with remarkable precision. Some researchers believe they developed eclipse prediction tables and created detailed observations of Venus cycles that rival those of later Maya astronomers. This level of astronomical knowledge required not just careful observation, but also mathematical tools for recording and predicting celestial events over long periods of time. Perhaps even more intriguing is the growing evidence for Olmec achievements in what we might call experimental science. The discovery of rubber balls dating to 1600 BC at the site of El Manatí represents the earliest known rubber processing in human history. The Olmecs had figured out how to extract latex from rubber trees and mix it with other plant materials to create a durable, elastic substance suitable for making balls, figurines, and other objects. This wasn't accidental discovery. It required systematic experimentation with different materials and processing techniques. The rubber balls themselves point to another Olmec innovation, the Mesoamerican ball game. While later cultures like the Maya and Aztecs are better known for this sport, archaeological evidence suggests the Olmecs invented it. The game wasn't just entertainment, it was a ritual activity with deep religious significance, involving elaborate ceremonies and sometimes human sacrifice. The fact that rubber balls appear at Olmec sites centuries before the earliest known ball courts suggests the game may have evolved over time from simpler beginnings into the complex ritual activity documented in later periods. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of Olmec intellectual achievement is their apparent understanding of concepts that wouldn't appear in other civilizations for centuries. Their art displays sophisticated knowledge of human anatomy, with sculptures showing accurate proportions and detailed understanding of muscle structure. Their architectural alignments suggest awareness of complex geometric relationships. Some researchers have even proposed that certain Olmec artifacts demonstrate knowledge of magnetic properties, though this remains highly controversial. What makes all of these achievements even more remarkable is the apparent speed with which Olmec civilization developed. Unlike other early civilizations that evolved gradually over millennia, the Olmecs seem to have burst onto the scene fully formed. The earliest evidence of complex Olmec society dates to around 1400 BC, but by 1200 BC they were already creating monumental architecture, sophisticated sculpture, and wide-ranging trade networks. This rapid development has puzzled archaeologists for decades and given rise to numerous theories about Olmec origins. Some researchers propose that Olmec civilization emerged from the interaction of multiple smaller cultures in the region, each contributing different skills and knowledge to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Others suggest that environmental pressures, perhaps climate change or population growth, forced rapid social innovation as communities struggled to adapt to changing conditions. A few bold theorists have even proposed outside influence, though there's no credible evidence for contact with Old World civilizations during this period. The truth is probably more complex than any single explanation. The Olmecs emerged during a period of significant cultural change throughout Mesoamerica, as societies across the region were developing new forms of social organization, religious practice, and technological capability. The Olmec heartland may have been particularly well positioned to take advantage of these broader trends, combining local innovations with ideas borrowed from neighboring cultures to create something entirely new. What we do know is that by 900 BC, Olmec influence extended far beyond their homeland in the Gulf Coast lowlands. Olmec-style artifacts have been found as far north as central Mexico and as far south as El Salvador. Olmec artistic motifs appear in the work of cultures that had no direct contact with the homeland. Olmec religious concepts, particularly the emphasis on jaguar symbolism and the association of rulers with supernatural power, became fundamental elements of Mesoamerican civilization that would persist for over 2,000 years. This cultural influence wasn't just about trade goods or artistic styles, it represented something far more profound. The Olmecs were essentially teaching other societies how to think about power, spirituality, and social organization in entirely new ways. Their concept of divine kingship, where rulers claimed direct connection to supernatural forces, became the template for political authority throughout Mesoamerica. Their religious practices, centered around bloodletting rituals and communication with jaguar spirits, provided the foundation for belief systems that would dominate the region until the Spanish conquest. But understanding Olmec religion requires us to venture into some of the darkest aspects of their civilization. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed evidence of practices that challenge our modern sensibilities while providing crucial insights into how the Olmecs understood the relationship between life, death, and cosmic balance. At the sacred site of El Manatí, archaeologists have uncovered what appears to be a ritual bog where the Olmecs made offerings to their gods for over 1,000 years. The offerings found at El Manatí paint a picture of religious practices that were both sophisticated and disturbing. Alongside the rubber balls and wooden sculptures, researchers discovered the remains of newborn infants and dismembered human bones. The evidence suggests that the Olmecs practiced infant sacrifice, possibly believing that the pure souls of children were necessary to maintain cosmic harmony. The precise circumstances of these deaths remain unknown, but their ritual context is unmistakable. This practice becomes even more chilling when we examine Olmec art more closely. Many of their sculptures depict what archaeologists call were-jaguars, hybrid beings that are part human infant, part jaguar. These figures often appear limp or lifeless, leading some researchers to speculate that they represent sacrificed children who were believed to transform into powerful spiritual beings after death. The connection between jaguars and sacrifice runs deep in Olmec iconography, reflecting their belief that these powerful predators served as intermediaries between the human world and the realm of the gods. The jaguar held such central importance in Olmec religion that some scholars refer to their culture as Tenosalome, meaning mouth of the jaguar. These magnificent predators, apex hunters of the Mesoamerican jungle, embodied everything the Olmecs associated with divine power: strength, stealth, the ability to move between the world of daylight and the shadowy realm of night. Olmec rulers identified so strongly with jaguars that they incorporated feline features into their own portraits, showing themselves with jaguar-like mouths, claws, and spotted patterns that may have been achieved through body modification or elaborate costumes. The transformation theme runs throughout Olmec art and suggests a worldview where the boundaries between human and animal, life and death, earth and sky, were far more fluid than in our modern understanding. Their sculptures show humans morphing into jaguars, birds transforming into serpents, and rulers taking on the attributes of supernatural beings. This wasn't simply artistic metaphor, it reflected deep beliefs about the nature of reality itself. These religious concepts were intimately connected to Olmec understanding of political power. Their rulers weren't just secular leaders, they were shamanic figures who claimed the ability to transform into animal spirits, communicate with the dead, and channel the forces of nature. The elaborate headdresses worn by the figures in the colossal heads weren't just symbols of rank, they may have been ritual gear designed to facilitate supernatural transformation during religious ceremonies. The evidence for these shamanic practices comes from more than just art. Archaeologists have found stingray spines, magi thorns, and obsidian blades at Olmec sites, all tools associated with bloodletting rituals. The Olmecs believed that royal blood was sacred, and that by piercing their tongues, earlobes, and genitals, rulers could open doorways between the human and divine realms. These painful rituals weren't acts of self-punishment, they were sophisticated religious technologies designed to alter consciousness and enable communication with supernatural forces. The complexity of these beliefs becomes even more apparent when we examine the astronomical knowledge embedded in Olmec religious practices. Their bloodletting ceremonies were timed to coincide with specific celestial events, eclipses, planet alignments, and seasonal transitions that held deep significance in their cosmological system. The Olmecs didn't just observe the stars, they saw them as active participants in an ongoing cosmic drama where human actions could influence the movement of celestial bodies. This integration of astronomy, religion, and politics created a form of governance unlike anything else in the ancient world. Olmec rulers legitimized their authority not through military conquest or economic control, but through their claimed ability to maintain cosmic balance. They were essentially cosmic engineers, using ritual knowledge to keep the universe functioning properly. When crops failed, when floods came, when enemies threatened, it was the ruler's responsibility to perform the ceremonies necessary to restore harmony between earth and sky. The sophistication of this system becomes clear when we realize that it required detailed record-keeping, precise timing, and coordination across multiple ceremonial centers. The Olmecs were essentially operating a civilization-wide religious calendar that synchronized ritual activities across hundreds of miles. This wasn't possible without some form of communication network and shared understanding of complex astronomical calculations. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Olmec civilization is how quickly and completely it vanished. Around 400 BC, after nearly 1,000 years of dominance, the major Olmec centers were systematically abandoned. Unlike other ancient civilizations that were conquered by enemies or destroyed by natural disasters, the Olmecs seem to have voluntarily walked away from their greatest achievements. The abandonment wasn't chaotic or sudden. Archaeological evidence suggests it was carefully planned and executed over several generations. Important sculptures were ritually buried or moved to new locations. Sacred objects were hidden in secret caches. Buildings were deliberately destroyed or sealed to prevent future use. It was as if the Olmecs were following some predetermined plan for shutting down their civilization. Various theories attempt to explain this mysterious disappearance. Climate change may have played a role, as volcanic activity in the region increased dramatically around this time. Ash falls from nearby volcanoes could have made agriculture difficult and forced populations to migrate. Some researchers point to evidence of social unrest, suggesting that the rigid hierarchical system that had sustained Olmec civilization for centuries finally collapsed under its own weight. Others propose that the abandonment was religious in nature, perhaps the fulfillment of some prophetic cycle that required the civilization to end at a predetermined time. The systematic burial of monuments and careful preservation of sacred objects suggests this wasn't destruction but transformation, as if the Olmecs were preparing their culture for some form of rebirth in the future. The environmental theory gains credibility when we examine the geological record. The period around 400 BC saw intense volcanic activity throughout central Mexico. Ash layers from this period have been found throughout the Olmec heartland, and some sites show evidence of being buried under several feet of volcanic debris. The eruptions would have blocked sunlight, contaminated water sources, and made the already challenging environment nearly uninhabitable. But volcanic activity alone doesn't explain the systematic nature of the abandonment. If people were simply fleeing natural disasters, we would expect to find evidence of hasty departures, abandoned tools, scattered belongings, incomplete construction projects. Instead, the archaeological record suggests careful planning and deliberate closure. The Olmecs didn't flee their homeland, they chose to leave it. The social collapse theory is equally compelling. By 400 BC, Olmec society had become increasingly complex and stratified. The massive labor projects required to build ceremonial centers and transport colossal sculptures may have placed unsustainable demands on the population. Archaeological evidence from late Olmec sites suggests growing inequality, with elite residences becoming more elaborate while commoner housing remained simple. This kind of social tension has led to the collapse of many civilizations throughout history. The religious transformation theory, while harder to prove, offers perhaps the most intriguing explanation. If Olmec rulers derived their authority from their ability to maintain cosmic balance, then a series of natural disasters, crop failures, or military defeats could have undermined their legitimacy completely. Unable to fulfill their cosmic responsibilities, they may have concluded that their time was over and that the civilization needed to end to make way for whatever was destined to come next. What makes this theory particularly compelling is the way Olmec cultural elements survived and spread, even as their political centers were abandoned. The Maya inherited their calendar systems. The Zapotecs adopted their writing techniques. Cultures throughout Mesoamerica continued to use their artistic styles and religious symbols. It was as if the Olmecs had completed their historical mission by seeding the entire region with the cultural tools needed for future civilizations to flourish. The mystery deepens when we consider that some Olmec groups may never have completely disappeared. In the mountains of modern-day Mexico, there are indigenous communities that maintain traditions remarkably similar to those depicted in ancient Olmec art. They still perform bloodletting rituals, still associate political authority with shamanic power, and still tell stories about were-jaguars and transformation. These communities don't claim direct descent from the ancient Olmecs, but the parallels are too striking to ignore. Recent genetic studies have added another layer to this puzzle. DNA analysis of modern populations in the Olmec heartland shows genetic markers that appear to be much older than the supposed arrival of the first humans in the Americas. Some researchers interpret this as evidence that the Olmec-inhabited Far region may have been continuously longer than previously believed, possibly by populations that developed in isolation from other American groups. If this interpretation is correct, it would mean that Olmec civilization wasn't a sudden emergence, but the culmination of thousands of years of cultural development by people who had been adapting to this challenging environment far longer than anyone realized. Their sophisticated knowledge of rubber processing, their understanding of local ecology, and their ability to thrive in a seemingly hostile landscape would make much more sense if they had been there for millennia rather than centuries. This possibility opens up entirely new questions about the peopling of the Americas and the development of civilization in the New World. If the Olmecs represent a much older cultural tradition than previously believed, then their achievements become even more remarkable. They wouldn't just be the first complex civilization in Mesoamerica, they might be the product of one of the longest continuous cultural developments in human history. But regardless of whether the Olmecs represented an ancient continuous tradition or a remarkable sudden emergence, their influence on human civilization extends far beyond what most people realize. When Spanish conquistadors first encountered the great Maya cities of the Yucatan, they marveled at the sophisticated calendar systems, the complex mathematical concepts, and the elaborate religious ceremonies. What they didn't know was that they were looking at innovations that had been perfected over 1,000 years earlier by a people whose name they would never learn. The Olmec legacy lives on in ways both obvious and hidden throughout modern Mexico and Central America. Walk through any market in rural Veracruz today, and you'll still see vendors selling rubber balls made using techniques that haven't changed substantially in 3,000 years. Visit ancient Maya sites like Chichen Itza or Tikal, and you'll find ball courts built according to proportions and rules established by Olmec priests centuries before Maya civilization reached its peak. Even more remarkably, recent archaeological work has begun to reveal just how far Olmec influence spread during their heyday. Olmec-style jade artifacts have been found in Costa Rica. Ceramic vessels bearing distinctly Olmec motifs have turned up in archaeological sites as far north as the southwestern United States. Obsidian tools crafted using Olmec techniques appear in sites throughout the Caribbean islands. This wasn't just trade, it was cultural transmission on a scale that suggests the Olmecs maintained contact with societies across thousands of miles of difficult terrain. The mechanisms behind this influence remain largely mysterious. The Olmecs had no horses, no wheeled vehicles, no large sailing ships that we know of. Yet somehow, their ideas, their artistic styles, and their technological innovations spread across the Americas with remarkable consistency. Some researchers propose that Olmec merchants established permanent trading colonies in distant regions, serving as cultural ambassadors who gradually introduced local populations to Olmec concepts and practices. Others suggest that the spread was more ideological than commercial. Olmec religious concepts, particularly their ideas about divine kingship and shamanic transformation, may have been so compelling that they were voluntarily adopted by societies seeking new forms of political legitimacy. The were-jaguar motif appears in cultures that had no jaguars in their local environment, suggesting they were borrowing not just artistic styles, but entire mythological systems from the Olmec homeland. The most intriguing possibility is that the Olmecs themselves were actively missionary in empires that spread their approach to cultural influence. Unlike later through military conquest, The Olmecs may have expanded their civilization through what we might call spiritual colonization. They sent out priests, shamans, and ritual specialists who established Olmec-style ceremonial centers in distant regions, gradually converting local populations to their worldview. Evidence for this missionary activity comes from the discovery of Olmec-style sculptures and architectural features at sites hundreds of miles from the heartland. These aren't imported objects, they're locally made artifacts that demonstrate detailed knowledge of Olmec artistic conventions and religious symbolism. Someone had to teach local craftsmen how to carve in the Olmec style, how to create the complex iconographic programs that decorated their ceremonial centers. The process of cultural transmission becomes even more fascinating when we examine how different societies adapted Olmec innovations to their own needs and environments. The Maya took the Olmec calendar system and developed it into an even more sophisticated tool for astronomical calculation. The Zapotecs borrowed Olmec writing techniques and created their own unique script. Highland cultures adapted Olmec architectural principles to build ceremonial centers suited to mountain environments. This pattern of creative adaptation suggests that Olmec influence wasn't simply imposed from outside, but was actively welcomed and transformed by recipient cultures. The Olmecs had created a kind of cultural toolkit, a set of concepts, technologies, and practices that could be modified and applied in different contexts. Their true genius may have been not just in developing these innovations, but in creating systems flexible enough to be successfully adopted by societies with very different needs and circumstances. The religious dimension of this influence is particularly striking. Olmec concepts about the relationship between rulers and supernatural forces became foundational to political systems throughout Mesoamerica. The idea that kings could transform into animal spirits, that royal bloodletting could maintain cosmic balance, that elaborate ceremonial centers were necessary to communicate with the gods, all of these concepts spread far beyond the Olmec heartland and remained central to American civilizations until the Spanish conquest. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Olmec cultural transmission was its durability. Even after the abandonment of their major centers, even after their political system collapsed, Olmec ideas continued to spread and evolve. The Maya long count calendar, which the Olmecs had invented, was still being used to calculate dates more than 1,000 years after the last Olmec city was abandoned. Olmec artistic motifs continued to appear in Aztec sculptures, created 1,500 years after the Olmec civilization had vanished. The Olmecs remain one of history's most profound enigmas, a civilization that emerged from the swamps of ancient Mexico to create innovations that would echo through millennia, only to vanish as mysteriously as they had appeared. Their colossal heads still gaze across time with secrets locked behind stone eyes. Their mathematical concepts still underpin our understanding of zero. Their rubber balls still bounce in village squares where children play games their ancestors invented 3,000 years ago. Perhaps the Olmecs never truly disappeared at all. Perhaps they simply transformed, scattering their wisdom like seeds across the Americas, ensuring that their greatest creation wasn't any single monument or artifact, but the very foundation of civilization itself. In studying the Olmecs, we don't just glimpse the past, we discover that the roots of human achievement run deeper and stranger than we ever dared imagine.